Okay, good morning. We are learning Lila Nishmas Mindel Mariam Bas Kaman Ruvain. I guess if you're listening to this and you're not on the Amud Yomi group chat, you should probably reach out to me, join the group chat, because we are hoping to make a siyum in just a couple of days when we finish Masech Shabbos, which is very exciting, and we'd love to celebrate properly with all of you and your families and all that. So please reach out. Okay, so let's begin. We're on the bottom of Kuf Mem Zayin Amud Beis. Ve'imach zirnas hashever. It's by the two dots. Last line. Ve'imach zirnas hashever. You're not allowed to set a broken bone. So if a bone is broken, you're not allowed to set it. Amar Rabbi Chana Bagdata Amar Shmuel. Rav Chana, who comes from Baghdad, said the following name of Shmuel: Halacha machzirnas hashever. Even though our Mishnah said you are not allowed to do so, the law is that you are allowed to set a broken bone. The assumption is that it's dangerous. It's dangerous to have a broken bone that is not set. It could ruin the limb. It's important to do so right away, and that is the halacha. The halacha is if a bone is actually broken, then it is important to set that broken bone, and you're allowed to do so on Shabbos, okay? Because there's a concern that it's going to ruin an entire limb, and that is something which we would be mechal Shabbos for, and therefore you're allowed to set a broken bone. Okay, so basically, bottom line is what that means. If a person breaks a bone, if you had read the Mishnah, you would think, okay, sorry, you got to wait till after Shabbos. Oh, that's not true. If a person breaks a bone, you are allowed to, you call a tzala, you get a call an Uber, whatever it is, and you go to probably call an Uber, by the way. I don't know why I bother Hatzala for that. If it's not a rush, meaning you're not in a rush, but you could go. You go to the hospital, you go to get a non-Jew to drive you, and you call an Uber, and that's it. And you go to the hospital. That is far better. Okay, but you're allowed to do so. Rabba Barbrachana Ikla Pumpadisa. Rabba Barbrachana visited Pumpadisa Lo Al Lefirkei Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabba Barbrachana, who is one of the great sages, did not go to the lecture given by Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, now Rabbi Yehuda wanted him there. The Mefarshim explained he wanted him there because their lectures were very interactive, and a person would speak and everyone would discuss and everyone would argue, and so he wanted to have Rabbi Yehuda there who would, add to the conversation. So it wasn't that he wanted Rabbi Yehuda necessarily just to listen to him. It wasn't like that. It wasn't like a top-down lecture. They would give a little bit and then they would go back and forth. So what did he do? Okay, Shadre le'ada dayala. He sent Ada, his attendant, to Rabbi Barbrachana. Armale zil garbe. He said, grab his cloak. Okay, I don't know. It's hard to understand why this is mutter, but he said confiscate his cloak and basically do like a little bit like you can't catch me type of thing. Like you want it back, great. You got to come to the study hall to get it back. Okay, I'm not hard to understand exactly why this is permitted. Azlo garbe. Bottom line is Ada went ahead and did this. He confiscated his cloak. Aska ashchedika darish imaksur neseshever. So Rabbi Barbrachana followed Ada to get his cloak back, and he found Rabbi Yehuda talking about this halacha of not setting. And he said you can't set a broken bone on Shabbos. Amar le Rabbi Barbrachana spoke up. He's in the room now, and he's going to speak up. He speaks up. He says, Rav Yehuda, Hachi Amar Rav Chana Bagdata Amar Shmuel. He quotes. He says, yeah, you just quoted a Mishnah, but I want to quote you from Rav Chana from Baghdad, name of Shmuel. Halacha machzirnas hashever. The law is that you are allowed to set a broken bone. Amar le Rav Yehuda said, Hachana didan v'Shmuel didan. Both Chana belongs to us, and Shmuel belongs to us. Meaning they're both Babylonian. They both come from Bavel. Avlo Shmueli. Yet we didn't hear it. V'la b'dina gvartich. So wasn't it right that we took your garments? In other words, look what good it came out of it. Okay, so again, I don't know. I don't believe you're allowed to take someone's garments even short term. So I'm not sure exactly halachically what the justification was, but that's the story. The story is he came, and in doing so, he was able to help him out. Okay, fine. So the last part of the Mishnah said the person's hand or foot became dislocated. You're not allowed to massage them in cold water, right? If you dislocated your arm, leg, you're not allowed to bathe it in cold water. What you're allowed to do is you're allowed to bathe your entire body in cold water, and in doing so, it's going to help your arm. But you can't just do a particular part because then it looks like it's being done for therapeutic purposes. Okay. Rav Avia have a Yosef kamed Rav Yosef. Rav Avia is one sitting in the presence of Rav Yosef. Shanya leyadeh. Okay, and Rav Avia's hand became dislocated. Okay, so Rav Avia is sitting in front of his teacher, and his hand becomes dislocated, and he's trying to figure out which type of therapies are allowed to be done for this dislocated arm. Again, if it breaks, we paskin, you're allowed to have a reset. If it becomes dislocated, it's not as dangerous, right? And he wanted to know, and we saw from the Mishnah, you're not allowed to treat the arm on its own. You're not allowed to just like wash the arm on its own. But he's trying to figure out are there certain types of therapies that can be done. So Amrle, Hachimai.
So you don't know that it's dislocated. I mean, my son he dislocated his arm when he was like 2 months old. Mm-hmm. And we took him to the doctor. We didn't think twice.
Okay, so if you don't know, like if you know, like we had an example of someone who comes to shir, and what's it called? And he his arms, like he's an adult, obviously, and his arm dislocates. He knows it's dislocated, and he knows what it is. But you're right. If it's a child, you don't know the situation, you don't know the story, it could cause significant harm. Then you would go. Anytime if there's any suffix, we would be machmer. But if a person knows for sure that it's dislocated, and you also know for sure that it's not going to cause long-term harm if you wait a few hours to put it back, you should wait to put it back. Yeah. Okay, so where are we? So he said Hachamai. So basically, Rav Avia starts going ahead and showing him all different types of therapies that might be allowed. Like, is this allowed? Is this allowed? Like, basically showing him all the different things. Hachimai, is this allowed? Aser. Rav Yosef, no, that's aser. Hachimai, is this thing allowed? He shows him a different practice. I'm like aser. So Adahachi itvach yade. While doing all these practice things, like showing him, like, is this exactly this is allowed? He ended up healing himself. He ended up like relocating his arm and showing him all those things. Okay, so Amar Leir of Yosef says to him, "Mainti bailach, what were you thinking? What were you thinking to even like look what you just did? You weren't allowed to do any of this. You basically just healed yourself. What were you thinking that there would have been any allowance for such a thing? We saw earlier in other earlier Mishnayos that you're not allowed to reload, you're not allowed to reset a dislocated arm. Like, what were you thinking that these different things would be allowed? Hatnan, we learned in the Mishnah, Mish nifrka yado raglo lo yitfrem etzonein. We saw in our Mishnah, if a person's hand or foot becomes dislocated, you're not allowed to massage them in cold water. Avarochitz kedarkav nisrape. We saw in the Mishnah, all you're allowed to do is wash your entire body in a regular fashion. So what were you thinking that any of these practices were going to be allowed? So Amar Leir of Avi responded to him, if Lotznan, doesn't it say in that same Mishnah, at the end of the Mishnah, you're not allowed to set a broken bone. And Rav Chana of Baghdad said you are allowed to put back a broken bone. Now, so what's the response? Rav Avia is assuming that in as much as Rav Chana of Baghdad said that you're allowed to put back a broken bone, he probably was arguing on the first part of the Mishnah as well, which was talking about a dislocated arm. In other words, even though there's two separate, right, one was saying talking about a dislocated arm, he said you can't fix that. You can just wash your entire body. You can't do therapy, but you can wash your whole body. And then it talked about a broken bone, and then so you can't fix that. You can't reset that. And then comes along Rav Chana and says, oh, you're allowed to fix the broken bone. So Rav Avia said, Rav Chana, who was saying you're allowed to fix a broken bone, he was probably arguing on the first part as well and saying you could take care of a dislocated arm as well. So Amar Leir of Yosef says to him, "Kulu kechada michisa sasnu." Did you all of the Mishnahs, are they woven as one weave? In other words, what are you doing? Who says it's all one halacha? There's two separate halachas over here. Heicha de itmar, where we find Rav Chana saying something in the name of Shmuel. We take that. In other words, where we see him arguing about the broken bone, great, we accept that. But we don't find him arguing on the dislocated arm. We can't go ahead and apply that, and therefore, no, there's two separate things. When it comes to a broken arm, everyone agrees, and that's a halacha that could be dangerous because it could cause your limb to be permanently broken if it's not set right away, and therefore the halacha is that you are allowed to go ahead and get a bone reset. But if it's a dislocated arm, assuming that it's not going to cause any long-term harm, then you are not allowed to do so. And just because Rav Chana argued in the second part of the Mishnah, we have no reason to assume he argues in the first part of the Mishnah. Okay? We finished the 22nd chapter. 2 chapters to go. 23rd, chapter 23, and here we have a discussion about doing business on Shabbos. 2 reasons why we can't do business on Shabbos. 1, there is a pasuk in Yeshaya which says, Mimtzo chavtzecha v'daber davar. You are not allowed to discuss business on Shabbos. There's Isser, right? This is where the whole, Nish Shabbos Garet thing comes in that people abuse. But basically, you're not supposed to talk about business on Shabbos. Any business talk on Shabbos is Asr. You can't do it. The other thing is that when a person actually engages in even some level of business, there's a concern that a person is going to write something down. So if you go, even, you don't use my words, but if I go ahead and make a transaction, there's a concern that I'm going to use, I'm going to go ahead and write something down, and writing, of course, is an Isser D'Oraisa. Those are the 2 reasons business is not allowed on Shabbos. As we'll see, it's going to include certain forms of borrowing. I'll tell you ahead of time, it's not like long-term borrowing is going to be included in that, because long-term borrowing, when a person does like a quick exchange, okay. But if a person does a long-term borrowing, there's a concern that a person may go ahead and want to write something down to ensure that they remember later on what happened. Okay, so it says the Mishnah on Kuf Mem Ches. Shol Adam Mechavero Kadayan Kadeshav. A person's allowed to borrow pitchers of wine or pitchers of oil from a friend on Shabbos. Uvilvad Shelo Yomer Lo Halveni. As long as you don't say lend me. Why don't you say lend me? As we'll see, there's 2 terms that are used to borrow. One is hashileni and one is halveni. So nowadays, in English at least, we say, can I borrow? There's not really 2 terms. But at least in Hebrew, the term halveni implies at least a 30-day loan. Okay? And if it's a 30-day loan, you're going to want to write it down. If you say hashileni, can I borrow it? Then it's understood. Tomorrow, Sunday, you're going to go to the store and buy a new one, you'll pay it back. That's fine. But if I say, can I borrow it, meaning a 30-day, there's a concern again that I'm going to end up writing it down, it seems. Okay? Similarly, a woman's allowed to borrow loaves of bread from her friends. If the lender does not trust, Maniach taliso etzlo, you're allowed to leave the cloak as collateral. Okay, so if you have a situation, so you are allowed to borrow as long as you make sure it's not, you don't say it's a long-term loan because you could come to writing. But if it's a situation where you don't necessarily trust the person, you are allowed to leave collateral. That's not too business-like. You're still allowed to do so. But then after Shabbos, you go ahead and you calculate how much is owed. Okay, so too in Yerushalayim, the day before Pesach, falls out on Shabbos. Parenthetically, the reason you have to make a cheshbon is because there is a whole discussion about lending. If I borrow a loaf of bread, am I allowed to actually pay back with the loaf of bread, or that might be a form of ribis? Okay, there's a whole discussion about that. We're not going to get into that right now. Bottom line is, if you borrow like an egg, you're allowed to give back an egg. That's the halacha we paskin like, but there is a larger discussion in the Mishnayos about ribis is anytime you give anything more. And so one of the ways that they did it was that you would borrow, make a monetary value. If I borrowed a thing of milk, I would say, oh, milk costs $3.50. Great. I owe you $3.50, and then I pay you back $3.50. That's the osim cheshbon after Shabbos, because you're not necessarily giving back the same thing you borrowed. You might be giving the monetary value. But okay, discussion onto its own. In Yerushalayim, when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, this year, if Mashiach comes, it's going to be a party. Why? It's going to be a party for a lot of reasons. But if Erev Pesach is on Shabbos, you have to have a korban. And let's say you were busy and you didn't go ahead and buy yourself an animal, and so now it's Erev Pesach and you can't buy something. So what do? You go to the animal seller and he gives you a lamb. Maniach taliso efslo, but that's an expensive thing. So you give him your cloak, you give him collateral. Okay, v'notelas pischo, you take your Pesach offering from him. And then after Yom Tov, you go ahead and you pay the guy for the lamb that you bought from him. Okay, fine. Says the Gemara, Amar le Rava bar Rav Chanan labaya, Maishna hashileni u'maishna halveni. Okay, so we already spoke this out. What's the difference between hashileni, which the Mishnah implied is permitted, and halveni, which the Mishnah said is asur? Amar le hashileni, if I say hashileni lo esi lemichtav, it's a short-term loan, and therefore I'm not going to write it down. Halveni, but if I use the word halveni, as the michtav, person's going to write it down. Ask the Gemara, v'akevan debechol zimnin debay lemeimar le halveni, v'amar le hashileni, v'lo kapi de levei, v'as le michtav, b'shabbos nami es le michtav. There's a concern. There's a concern that people are not necessarily so precise with their language. And during the week, even if I meant it to be a long-term loan, I might sometimes say hashileni, even though it's understood that I'm going to pay you back in a while. And the lender understands that, and the lender will still go ahead and write. Let's say on a Sunday you come to someone's house and say, oh, hashileni, whatever, a jug of wine. And it's understood, you all know that I didn't mean, short term versus long. I meant borrow, I might pay back in a while. And that's fine. No one cares that I use the word hashileni, and even though I meant it as a long-term loan. So and what does the lender do? They write it down. They write it down in such a case. So the problem is going to be on Shabbos. Even if I use the word hashileni, the lender might be thinking to themselves, okay, granted you said hashileni, but this could be a long-term loan. It could be at least a 30-day loan. I could end up writing it down, right? That's a concern. So the Gemara says, Amarle, no. I'll just skip the parentheses. B'Shabbos, on Shabbos, kevan dashileni hu d'shar le'arbanan. On Shabbos, person's going to be more careful. Because we all know the halacha, everyone knows the halacha, because everyone learned Masech Shabbos, everyone knows the halacha, that the rabbis came along and said, on Shabbos you could do hashileni, you can't do halveni. And therefore you're right, during the week, we're not so careful about the terminology because it doesn't have ramifications. But on Shabbos, since everyone knows that hashileni has a significant difference than halveni, therefore, when I use the word hashileni, we know that since the rabbis came along and said you're allowed to say hashileni, you're not allowed to say halveni, then minkar milsa is obvious what the person's doing. They're not going to come to write it down. Okay, bottom line is, in our day and age, to borrow something from a neighbor and say, can I borrow it, is going to be allowed. We don't assume they're going to write it down, and therefore that can be done in a setting where there could have two connotations. There's going to be implied that a very long-term loan, that would be problematic. Ask your local Orthodox rabbi. Okay, another discussion between Rava Baruch Chanan and Abaye. Amalei Rava Baruch Chanan Abaye. Michte. Amar Rabbanan called Mili di Yom Tov Kama de Afshel Shanim. So this is really not relevant to our last discussion, just a dialogue between the same two people that we just had above. So Amar Rabbanan called Mili di Yom Tov Kama de Afshel Shanim Meshinan. Anytime that you have an activity which would be usher on Shabbos and allowed on Yom Tov, the rabbi said you should try to adjust, try to do it a little bit differently. Okay, wherever you could deviate, you should deviate. So he asked, Hani Nashe de Malyan Chatz Bayu Maya, women who fill their buckets with water, okay, and carry them home. in Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Tov, there's no issue of carrying. My time alum shaninan. Why don't we force them? Why don't we tell them they have to deviate in the way you carry? They're carrying in the regular way. They should deviate. So says Abaya, what's the question? It's not possible to deviate. The deviation only makes sense where it's just as easy to make that change. So it becomes clear. Oh, this is on Shabbos is usher. But if there's no good way to deviate, you can't do so. So he spells it out. He says, "Hey, what do you want them to do? If you want them to use large buckets instead of small buckets, limalu b'chatzba zuta." If you want to suggest that those who are using large buckets should use small buckets, hakam mapshu bihilucha. What you end up doing, if I tell you to use a bunch of small buckets instead of one big bucket, what's going to happen? You end up traveling more. We don't want a person to do more exertion on Yom Tov. That's not allowed. So what do you want to do? You want to tell me that those who draw with small buckets should use a big bucket? You end up increasing your load. That's also a bad idea, right? So what should you do? Nifros sudra, maybe put a kerchief on top of the bucket. If you put a kerchief on top of the bucket, it might get all wet, and you're going to end up squeezing it out. Cover the bucket with the lid. The cord attached to the lid to the bucket might break, and you might come to tie it. The bottom line is there's no normal way to deviate, and therefore we don't force a person to do so, and that is their discussion. Okay, another discussion, one that relates to Shabbos. Very and quite relevant and quite controversial. Rava bar Rav Chana le'Abaye. Tznan. It was taught in a Mishnah Beitza. Lo misapkin v'lo mitapchin v'lo meraktim Yom Tov. You're not allowed to clap your hands. You're not allowed to beat your chest. And you're not allowed to dance on Yom Tov. And certainly on Shabbos. Woo. What's going on? People dance on Shabbos. People dance on clap on Shabbos. Okay, we'll come back to these. We'll come back to it. Okay, ask the Gemara. The Gemara says we see people doing such things. We see people clapping their hands, beating their chests, and dancing on Yom Tov. Okay, beating their chest was a way of also making music. This is as much as they were clapping, they would go like this, and that would also make music. We don't say anything. So he says back. Abaye says, okay, he says according to your reasoning. Okay, that your reasoning, meaning that we assume that we always have to protest what we see people doing wrong. Hada Amar Rava lo leisev inish apuma delachia. We saw earlier that a person is not supposed to sit at the edge of an alleyway right by the lechi. Okay, we're getting into our Eruvin discussion over here. But if you're sitting right at the edge of an alleyway, and there's a lechi, there's a beam on top, so you're allowed to carry in the alleyway. Technically, you could carry on the threshold, but you shouldn't sit right on the threshold. Why? Because dilma migander lechefetz, because you might be holding on to something and it might fall out. And it might fall out into the Rishus Harabim, and you might go ahead, and it might carry back in, and that's going to be problematic. Therefore, don't sit on the edge, right? He says, we see women place their buckets, and they sit at the edge of the alleyway. It seems like people would spend time putting things right at the edge of the alleyway for whatever reason, and no one protests. So what's going on, right? You see people are not protesting. Ella, so Abaye says, very important rule, Hanach Yisrael, leave the Jewish people alone. Mutav shushogin v'al Yomi zidin. It's best that they are unintentionally violating as opposed to deliberately violating. Okay, so what's the halacha is like this. This is and let's one more line actually. Samar mina hani mili. They thought that this was b'drabanan only with rabbinic law. Aval b'daraisa lo. Maybe when it comes to daraisas, we should rebuke people. V'lohi, it's not true. Lo shna b'drabanan lo shna b'daraisa. It's whether it's rabbinic or biblical. If rebuking, you should not rebuke. Better to let people make the mistake let them do the sin by mistake as opposed to on purpose, both for rabbinic and biblical. What's the proof to it? So Tosefes Yom Kippurim D'Oraisa, because there is a biblical law that you have to add a little bit to the fast of Yom Kippur, both at the beginning and the end. And we see people eating and drinking right until the last second. And we don't see people protesting, even though it's D'Oraisa. So you see this principle of Mutav Shu Shogun. Okay, so very two things we have to unpack over here. First of all, how far reaching is this? What, you shouldn't tell people off? I see my kid doing something wrong. I shouldn't tell them they're wrong. I see someone ask me a shayla, like, I'm not going to tell them because better that they do it by mistake, right? No. The answer is, in a scenario where you know someone that you're going to tell someone and you know they're not going to listen, then we apply the principle of Mutav Shu Shogun, V'lo Yimizidin. That's better that they are mistaken and not doing things on purpose. But in a situation where a person is going to listen, we don't have, or there's even a possibility that they're going to listen, then we're obligated to go ahead and tell them the right thing to do, right? We have a principle of Arvas that I'm responsible, we're all responsible for each other. If you see me doing something wrong, you got to tell me, I got to tell you, because we have to help each other do what's right. So Mutav Shu Shogun, V'lo Yimizidin is in a scenario where you know you could know definitively that the person is simply not going to listen, then it's okay. They also had another caveat. That is only, and a very almost counterintuitive caveat. That's only if they're doing it by mistake. If you know that someone's doing it deliberately, there is a whole discussion about the fact that you still should actually protest. That there's value in protesting. It's only when a person's doing it by mistake, and you know you're going to tell them, you're going to think, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Yeah, it's a chumrah, whatever it is. They're not going to listen. That's when it's better to mutav shu shogun. So it's a little bit, the parameters are not, but if there's a chance they're going to listen, you should tell them. We have responsibilities one another. We care about each other as much as if I see you doing something dangerous, I should tell you. If I see you doing something halachically dangerous, I have a responsibility to tell you. Fine, and therefore I should tell you. Okay, so let's get back to clapping. Why do you see people clapping on Shabbos? Why do you see people dancing on Shabbos? So there's a number of, all the way back to Tosfos, there's a large, the reason behind this is that it may lead to a person fixing instruments on Shabbos, which Tosfos points out already that, who's fixing an instrument like on the spot? Like typically you have to send to shop and this and that, and Tosfos already lays out a leniency, and there's a massive discussion or debates among the Rishonim and Achronim as to whether or not this decree applies nowadays. Some saying absolutely, and some saying it does not, and that's why you'll see some people, clapping on Shabbos regularly, some people not clapping on Shabbos regularly, based on this debate as to whether or not it's allowed. The Aruch HaShulchan, based on Tosfos, says that they're not going to fix the musical instruments on the spot, and therefore that whole concern isn't there. B, the way they clap and the way they dance was different back then. It's not the way that we clap and we dance, and therefore it's not included. It's worth noting that even those who say it's for, so that's why again you'll see people clapping like this. Dancing on Shabbos is highly questionable. They point out Simchas Torah might be different. It's dancing for a mitzvah. Also depends on but it is unanimous, and I don't know why people don't know this, and that is that the clapping that we're talking about is rhythmic clapping. Okay, the Isser would be like clapping on rhythm. But if a person, if we made an announcement and we're clapping our hands and just going like this, no one says that's Usser. I don't know why people still will clap backwards or whatever it is, and that's there, whatever. They just don't know. That's fine. Mutav shu shogun. No, just kidding. It's fine. They're being machmir. It's fine. But the point is that clapping, which is non-rhythmic, is 100% mutter. It's only clapping on rhythm. That's where, again, I would say the majority of poskim say it's not allowed, but there certainly is a strong basis to rely upon that a person is allowed to clap on Shabbos because that decree may not, the specific parameters of the decree do not apply nowadays. Okay, longer discussion, but we don't have so much time. Okay, have a great day.